I had been out camping alone for a couple of nights in a remote part of the woods when it happened. I had picked a spot well away from the trails, far from where most people would bother to hike. I liked the quiet, the kind of silence that only exists deep in the woods. My tent was set up on a patch of flat ground between some pines, with a little stream trickling a few yards away. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, and at night I could hear nothing but the soft rustle of branches when the wind moved through. That particular night had started like the others. I made a small fire, cooked a bit of food, and then let the flames die down before crawling into my tent. I had gone through the same routine, checking my pack, making sure I had the bear bag tied up a distance from camp, making sure the tent zipper was pulled tight. Everything felt normal, safe in the way I had come to rely on during trips like this. At some point in the middle of the night, though, I woke up to a noise that immediately made my stomach tighten. At first, I wasn't even sure if I was awake. The sound was faint, almost like the soft scrape of something sliding across fabric. I lay there completely still, straining to hear. Then it came again, long, slow, deliberate, a dragging sound, like claws pulling lightly but intentionally across the thin nylon wall of my tent. It wasn't a quick brush, not the way branches scrape if the wind pushes them. This was slower, steadier, and much too close. I froze. My breathing felt too loud, so I tried to control it, taking shallow breaths. The sound moved along one side of the tent, starting at the corner near my feet, pulling upward toward my head. I could almost picture it, something crouched just inches from me, tracing along the tent wall. I didn't move. I didn't even dare to reach for my flashlight. The fabric was so thin that if I lit the inside, whatever was outside would know exactly where I was. Every instinct screamed for me to stay silent. The dragging came again, this time higher up, near where my head rested. The nylon shivered slightly with each pass, the faint vibration carrying through the thin material into the air of the tent. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The sound would stop for a while, then start again, sometimes from another side. I kept waiting for the shape of a hand or paw to press into the fabric, but nothing pushed inward. It was always just the dragging. My imagination started to run in circles, and my heart hammered so hard I was sure it would be heard outside. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. No more scraping, no more movement, just the whisper of leaves overhead. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay there rigid, eyes wide open in the dark, counting every faint sound. When the first gray light of morning started filtering through the thin material of the tent, I finally let myself sit up. Cautiously, I unzipped the flap and stepped out. The forest was quiet, cool, and still damp with morning dew. I expected to see prints in the soil, paw marks, boot treads, anything that might explain what I had heard. The ground around the tent was soft, covered with a layer of pine needles and patches of bare earth where prints usually showed clear. But there was nothing. No indentations, no disturbed needles, nothing at all. It was as if nothing had ever been there. I circled the tent several times, checking carefully, crouching low to look from different angles. I even followed the stream bed nearby to see if the mud there might have caught something, but the surface was smooth. No broken twigs, no trampled grass. Just the same quiet, untouched woods. I went back to the tent and ran my hand over the side where I had heard the scraping. The nylon looked normal. No rips, no snags, but I could still hear the sound in my head, the long, deliberate drag of something sharp moving across the thin wall between me and the outside. For the rest of that day, I couldn't shake the unease. Normally, I enjoyed the solitude, but every time the woods grew quiet, I felt exposed. I kept scanning the trees, listening for the faintest movement. When I set up camp again that evening, I hesitated before even pitching the tent. I thought about packing up and heading back, but the hike was long, and I told myself maybe it had been a raccoon, maybe something small brushing against the tent in a way that only sounded deliberate in the dark. Still, I kept the fire burning longer than usual that night. I made sure my flashlight was in my sleeping bag with me, gripped in my hand. I lay there with my ears straining against the silence, waiting to hear it again. It didn't come. Not that night, not the next. But the feeling of it stayed with me. The certainty that something had been outside my tent, dragging claws or nails with careful, measured pressure, as if it wanted me to know it was there. The emptiness of the ground in the morning, the lack of any mark or footprint, only made it worse. If it had been an animal, I should have seen something. If it had been a person, I should have found some trace. I finished the trip, but the rest of the time I never felt at ease. The woods no longer felt like the quiet, safe place I had always believed them to be. Even when nothing was happening, my nerves were tight, listening for that dragging sound in every rustle of leaves or scrape of branch. When I finally made it back to my car and drove home, I thought the feeling would fade. But even now, lying in my bed at night, sometimes I'll wake to the memory of it. The sound of claws slowly tracing along the thin wall inches from my head, deliberate and unhurried, as though whatever was out there knew it didn't need to rush. And I still can't explain why there was no sign of it the next morning. No tracks, no damage, nothing at all. That emptiness was almost worse than the sound itself. It left me with the thought I can't shake. Sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can see or find proof of. It's the things that leave nothing behind, the things that make you question if you'll ever feel safe closing your eyes in a tent again. That night had been like most other nights I had spent camping. The woods were quiet, the fire had burned low, and the air carried that damp chill that always settles heavy after midnight. I was out by myself, tucked away off a side trail far enough that no one would likely stumble on me. I had eaten, cleaned up, and crawled into my tent for sleep. Before zipping myself in, I slipped off my boots and set them neatly outside the flap. I didn't think much of it. I'd done that many times before. I figured the tent floor would stay cleaner, and my boots would air out overnight. The ground was dry enough, and the sky was clear, so I didn't worry about dew or rain. I remember placing them side by side, toes pointed toward the tent, exactly where I would reach for them in the morning. The night passed without anything unusual. There were the usual forest sounds, the faint rustle of leaves, a few night insects, the distant call of an owl. Nothing that kept me awake. At some point, I drifted into a deep, heavy sleep. When I woke, the sun was already lifting through the treetops, painting the ground in pale light. I unzipped the tent, expecting to pull my boots on before starting the morning routine. But the space where I had left them was empty. At first I thought maybe I had shoved them farther under the flap without realizing. So I patted the ground, then leaned out, scanning the dirt and pine needles. That was when I saw it. In place of my boots sat a rabbit, dead. Its body laid out neatly, almost too neatly, right in the spot my boots had been. Its fur was matted in places, its small body stiff, but there was no mess of blood, no torn flesh scattered. It hadn't been eaten. It hadn't been dragged. It looked placed. I froze there half in, half out of the tent, staring at it. The realization spread through me like ice. My boots had been taken. Something or someone had stood right outside while I slept, close enough to reach the flap of my tent, and swapped them for that rabbit. My first instinct was to search the ground. The soil around the tent was soft in patches, littered with pine needles, easy to hold prints. I moved slowly, scanning every inch, but what I found was nothing clear. A few faint disturbances, maybe, but nothing I could say for sure was a track. It was like whoever or whatever had been there knew how to step carefully, how to avoid leaving a mark. The rabbit itself made my stomach turn more than anything. It wasn't left in some random heap. It was positioned neatly, almost respectfully, like a deliberate offering. Its head pointed toward the tent flap, its paws tucked just under its chest. The longer I stared, the worse it felt. That wasn't an accident. Someone had placed it there with intention. I didn't touch it right away. I sat on the ground just inside the tent, staring at the lifeless shape, trying to think. My boots were gone. I had one pair, heavy and broken in for this trip, and now they were missing. I looked around the clearing, scanning under the trees, hoping maybe an animal had dragged them off. But there was nothing, no scattered laces or torn leather, no sign of them at all. The rabbit stayed there like a warning, like a reminder that I wasn't alone out there. My mind went to the possibility of animals, but animals don't take boots neatly, and they don't replace them with intact prey. That left only one explanation. Someone had walked into my camp in the middle of the night. Someone close enough to hear me breathing in the tent, close enough to take my boots without waking me, and thoughtful or twisted enough to leave that rabbit in their place. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. If it had been a prank, why out there in a place so far off the main trail? If it was a hunter, why not just leave me alone? Whoever it was, they hadn't woken me, hadn't made a sound loud enough to rouse me. They had been deliberate, careful, and patient. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. Without boots, hiking back would be brutal, but I couldn't convince myself to linger there. I slipped on my spare shoes, thin-soled trail runners I had packed as backups, and quickly tore down camp. Every snap of a twig in the trees made me flinch. Every patch of shadow felt like it was hiding someone watching me. My hands shook as I stuffed gear into my pack. I couldn't shake the image of someone crouched just outside the tent in the dark, quietly lifting my boots and placing that rabbit with methodical care. Leaving the clearing, I kept checking behind me. The forest felt different now, less like a refuge, more like something closing in. My ears strained for footsteps behind me, for breathing, for anything. But the woods gave me nothing, just silence broken by the occasional bird call. The hike out was long and rough. My spare shoes weren't meant for it, and every sharp rock and root pressed through thin soles. My pace slowed, but I forced myself to keep moving, looking back more often than forward. I didn't stop for food, didn't sit down for rest. I just pushed until I saw the trailhead and my car waiting where I had left it. When I finally shut the car door and locked it, a flood of relief hit me, but it didn't erase the feeling that had built since that morning. My boots were gone. Somewhere out there, someone had them, and they had left me a dead rabbit in return. The thing that sticks with me isn't just the loss of the boots, it's the intention. That rabbit wasn't left by chance. It was placed with care, like a message. I still don't know what the message was supposed to be. A warning? A joke? Something darker? What chills me most is knowing someone got that close without me hearing a thing. They were right there, beside me, close enough to touch the tent, and I slept through it. That was the last time I ever left my boots outside. More than that, it was the last time I camped alone so deep in the woods. I can't shake the thought that if they wanted to, they could have taken more than just the boots. They could have unzipped the tent, stepped inside, and I wouldn't have known until it was too late. Instead, they chose to leave me that rabbit, and not knowing why is worse than anything else. I had set up camp miles off the main trail, deep enough into the woods that I hadn't seen another person all day. It was the kind of silence that only came when you were completely removed from towns, roads, and even the busier hiking paths. By the time the sun went down, I had finished dinner and tucked myself into the tent, the fire dying low outside. It was a cool night, the kind that made the nylon walls damp with condensation. I had fallen asleep to the steady hum of crickets and the occasional distant call of an owl. Hours must have passed. At some point, I woke up suddenly, for no reason I could name. The tent was completely dark except for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the fabric. My watch read just past 3 in the morning. As I lay there, trying to convince myself to drift back to sleep, I saw it. A narrow, bright beam of light cut across the wall of my tent. It was sharp and white, unmistakably a flashlight. The beam swept slowly, tracing along the nylon, then pausing as if whoever held it was looking directly at the tent. My chest tightened instantly. I had seen no one all day. There weren't supposed to be other campers out here. I had gone so far off the trail to avoid exactly that. But someone was outside, close enough that their light was spilling right over me. I froze, holding my breath, every nerve on edge. The beam moved again, gliding across one side of the tent, then over the top, then circling to the other side. It wasn't jittery like a hiker fumbling around in the dark. It was smooth, controlled, too deliberate, and the silence was worse than the light itself. No footsteps, no snapping twigs, no brush of clothing, just that silent, steady movement of a flashlight beam circling me. I strained my ears, waiting for the sound of breathing or movement, but there was nothing. The crickets even seemed to have gone still, like the whole forest was holding its breath with me. The only proof I wasn't imagining it was the way the beam cut sharp against the fabric, shifting from one angle to the next. Every instinct screamed at me not to make a sound, not to move. The tent felt impossibly thin. I pictured the zipper on the flap, how easily it could be undone, how quickly someone could be inside. My knife was in my pack by the door, but reaching for it would mean rustling the fabric, giving myself away. The beam lingered on one side for what felt like forever. I could almost see the shape of it hovering, as if the person holding it was standing completely still, pointing the light directly at my head. My heart hammered so hard I thought the sound would betray me. Then, after a long pause, the beam began to move again. It slid slowly, silently, making another circle around the tent. Once, twice. Each time it passed, my skin prickled as though whoever was outside was studying me, deciding something. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. No fading footsteps, no sound of someone walking into the trees. The light just stopped, leaving me in the suffocating dark, straining for any clue of where it had gone. I didn't sleep again. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the thin fabric of my sleeping bag, ears wide open until the black gave way to the pale gray of morning. When daylight finally came, I unzipped the tent slowly, my stomach in knots. The clearing looked the same as when I had crawled inside the night before. The fire pit sat cold. The trees stood still and quiet. I searched the ground for footprints, any trace of someone walking close to the tent, but the earth was littered with pine needles, soft and undisturbed. There was nothing. No broken branches, no boot prints, no sign at all that anyone had stood there with a flashlight in the dead of night. The silence of the morning felt heavier than usual. Normally it brought relief, but now it felt empty, like the woods had swallowed the evidence whole. I packed quickly, my hands unsteady as I stuffed gear into my pack. Every minute I stayed there felt wrong, like whoever had been outside was still nearby, watching me from a distance. The hike back was brutal. My nerves stayed tight, snapping at every sound. The creak of branches overhead, the crunch of my own boots, even the calls of birds. At one point I thought I saw movement between the trees, a flicker of shadow where it shouldn't have been. But when I stopped to look, there was nothing. Just the woods standing silent and endless. By the time I made it back to the trailhead and the sight of my car, my body felt wrung out from tension. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring into the trees, replaying the sight of that beam cutting across my tent in the dead of night. The thing that eats at me isn't just the fact that someone was there. It's how deliberate it felt. They didn't stumble into my camp by accident. They didn't call out or make their presence known. They circled me silently, for what must have been minutes, sweeping that light over my tent again and again. If it had been an animal, I'd have tracks or noise to point to. If it had been another camper, I'd expect to hear footsteps or see their sight nearby. But there was nothing, just the memory of that light, moving with intent, and the silence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. That was the last time I camped deep alone. The woods had always been a place of peace for me, a place where I felt safe in the quiet. But that night changed it. Now, when I think about sleeping under thin nylon walls, I don't hear the hum of crickets or the whisper of the wind. I see that flashlight beams slicing through the dark, moving slow and careful, held by someone who never said a word. And the worst part is knowing they left without a trace, not because they couldn't come closer, but because, for whatever reason, they chose not to. I had chosen a spot off a narrow trail by the lake, far enough from the main campground that I wouldn't hear anyone else. It was the kind of quiet I went looking for when I camped alone. The lake was still when I arrived, the water smooth like glass, and the forest around it was heavy with the smell of wet pine and mud. I pitched my tent on a patch of flat ground under some trees, just high enough that the damp from the lake wouldn't seep through the floor. The day had been uneventful. Hiking, fishing, a small fire for dinner. By the time the sun went down, the woods had settled into their rhythm. Crickets chirping, the occasional splash from the lake, a breeze pushing through the tops of the trees. I put out the fire and zipped myself into the tent. Inside, It was warm and dark, and the only sounds I could hear were my own steady breaths and the faint whisper of wind moving through branches. I must have fallen asleep fast, because the next thing I remember was the sharp brightness of morning sun pressing through the fabric. I turned over, groggy, stretching my arms, and rubbed the sleep from my eyes. It was then, just as I shifted onto my side, that I saw it. A handprint, right next to where my head had been all night, smeared across the thin nylon wall of the tent, was a large, muddy handprint. The fingers were spread wide, the palm heavy, and the streaks of dried mud looked thick and deliberate. It was big, much bigger than my own hand, and dark enough that it stood out even in the morning light. For a few seconds, I just stared at it, my brain slow to catch up. Then the realization hit me hard. Someone had been right there, inches from me, while I slept. They had pressed their hand against the tent wall, directly next to my head, with only the thin fabric separating us. I sat up fast, my heart pounding, and unzipped the flap to look outside. The air was cool and damp. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, the fire pit cold, the lake glinting in the distance, the ground littered with needles and wet soil. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the handprint on the tent said otherwise. I got out and circled the tent, scanning the ground. The soil was soft, damp from rain earlier in the week. Should have shown tracks, but around the tent, there was nothing clear. A few scuffed patches, maybe, but nothing distinct enough to tell if it was from boots or animals. Whoever had been there, if they had circled the tent, they had been careful, deliberate, stepping in ways that left almost no trace. I went back to the print itself. Up close, I could see where the mud had smeared unevenly, clumps drying against the thin nylon. The fingers were long, the spread wide, and the angle made it clear the hand had been pressed firmly against the fabric. It wasn't the kind of accidental brush that might happen if someone stumbled past. It was deliberate. Someone had leaned close, placed their hand there, and held it for a moment, long enough to leave that thick, muddy mark. The thought made my stomach twist. While I slept, unaware, someone had been close enough to hear me breathing, close enough to push their face right up against the tent if they wanted. And I hadn't woken up. I had no idea how long they stayed there, watching, pressing that hand against the thin wall, leaving the mark as if to remind me that they had been there. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it had been another camper wandering too close, but I hadn't seen anyone for miles. And if it were an animal, it wouldn't leave a human handprint. Not that size, not with that shape. No, this was someone who had walked into my camp in the dead of night, approached the tent, and reached out. For the rest of the morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. As I packed my gear, I kept looking over my shoulder at the tree line. Every snap of a twig, every shift of leaves in the breeze made my chest tighten. I moved quickly, shoving things into my pack, glancing back at that smeared handprint again and again. I thought about staying another night, about brushing it off as nothing, but I couldn't do it. Not with that proof right there on the tent. That mark told me someone had found me, and I had no way of knowing if they'd come back. The hike out felt longer than it should have. My nerves were tight, straining for sounds behind me. At one point, I thought I heard movement, soft steps in the brush parallel to the trail. But when I stopped and turned, the forest stood silent and still. I pushed harder, not stopping to rest, not even stopping for water. My boots crunched against the dirt, and I kept my eyes fixed forward, afraid of what I might see if I turned too often. When I reached the trailhead and saw my car, relief washed over me, but it was thin and shaky. I tossed my pack inside and sat there with the door locked, staring out at the line of trees. The woods that usually felt safe and familiar now felt different, darker, like something in them had shifted. Driving away, I kept replaying it in my head, the size of that handprint, the way it had been smeared right next to where I had lain with my head against the tent wall. It hadn't been random. Whoever left it had chosen that spot, inches from my face, knowing I wouldn't wake up to see them. They wanted me to find it in the morning. That thought has stayed with me more than the print itself. It wasn't just someone passing by. It was someone who wanted me to know they had been there, close enough to reach in if they wanted, close enough to unzip the tent in the middle of the night. But instead, they left me that mark, silent and deliberate, like a message I'll never fully understand. It was the last time I camped alone. I still go out sometimes, but always with others, and I never let myself fall asleep with my head against the side of the tent. Because I know how thin that fabric is, how close someone can get without me ever stirring. And I can't stop thinking about how easily that muddy handprint could have been more than just a warning. I had gone out on this trip for the same reason I always went into the backcountry: peace, space, and the kind of quiet that only existed miles from anyone else. I had hiked about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead, following a winding path that cut deep into a valley, and then climbed up onto a ridge that overlooked a wide stretch of forest. The kind of spot where, if you stopped moving and just listened, you could hear your own heartbeat. I liked it that way. It was why I chose places like this, why I carried everything I needed on my back and slept on the hard ground. I wanted to be away from people. That night, I pitched my tent on a patch of flat ground just inside the tree line, not far from a narrow stream. I ate a simple meal, packed up my food properly to keep animals away, and watched the sun dip below the ridge. When the woods finally went dark, they went fully dark. No distant headlights, no hum of cars, no voices on other trails. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of the forest shifting into night. I lay down in my sleeping bag, letting the warmth settle over me as the air grew colder. The first few hours were normal: crickets outside, the occasional snap of a twig from some small animal, the faint trickle of water from the stream. It was the kind of background noise I'd grown used to. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The air inside the tent felt colder, sharper, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I rolled onto my back, listening. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost like it was slipping just under the fabric of the tent. At first, I thought maybe I was still half asleep, caught between a dream and reality. But then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, low and steady, saying my name. Not shouted, not even spoken loudly, just whispered, like someone crouched right outside the tent wall, inches from my head, and breathed it into the nylon. Every hair on my body stood up. I froze, barely breathing. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe I had misheard the wind through the trees. Maybe an animal moved in a way that tricked my ears. But the sound wasn't random. It wasn't background noise. It was my name, and it was too deliberate to be mistaken. I stayed perfectly still, trying to listen past the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. A long minute passed, then another. The forest outside was silent now. No crickets, no rustling. Just silence so heavy it made the whisper stand out even more in my memory. Then it came again. My name. Same tone, same rhythm. Whispered like whoever it was already knew me, already expected me to respond. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My flashlight was within reach, but the thought of clicking it on made my chest tighten. If someone really was out there, I wasn't sure I wanted them to know I was awake. The whisper didn't come again right away, but I could hear something else. Breathing, soft but steady, moving slightly as if someone shifted their weight just outside. It circled the tent slowly, grass crunching lightly underfoot, then stopped again right by my head. I stared so hard at the fabric of the tent wall that I thought I might burn a hole through it. Minutes dragged by. My muscles ached from staying so tense, but I couldn't relax. I thought about unzipping the tent and rushing out with my knife, but the idea of coming face to face with someone out here in the dark, 10 miles from the nearest trailhead, far from anyone who should even be here, was worse than sitting still. At some point, the breathing faded. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, just less and less sound until the forest felt empty again. I lay there until my eyes felt heavy, my body drained from adrenaline. Eventually, without meaning to, I drifted back into a shallow, restless sleep. When I woke in the gray light of morning, the fear from the night before still clung to me. I unzipped the tent slowly and looked around. Nothing, no sign of anyone. The ground near the tent was soft from the previous day's rain, and I bent down to look closely at it. That was when I saw them. Footprints, not boots, Not heavy hiking shoes like mine, bare feet. The impressions were clear, pressed deep into the mud. They circled the tent in a full loop, close enough that whoever left them had been leaning in, standing just inches from the nylon wall. One set stopped directly where my head had been inside the tent, right where the whisper had come from. The tracks weren't old either. The edges were sharp, damp, made during the night. I counted at least a dozen of them before I forced myself to stop. I didn't waste time. I packed my gear as fast as I could, rolling everything up with shaking hands. I kept my knife in my pocket and checked over my shoulder every few seconds. When I finally started hiking out, I walked fast, almost jogging in some stretches, my mind locked on one thought. Whoever had been outside that tent knew my name. There was no way they could have known it by accident. I hadn't spoken to anyone since I left the trailhead. I hadn't even passed another hiker on the way in. Yet someone had been out there, close enough to whisper, close enough to watch me sleeping, close enough to leave their prints in the mud like a mark they wanted me to see. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was sweating through my shirt even though the air was still cold. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me down the trail with bare feet on the wet ground. But the path stayed empty. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, I sat there for a long time with my hands on the wheel, breathing hard. The relief of leaving the woods didn't settle in right away, because the bigger question pressed harder than anything else. How did they know my name? I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I hadn't spoken a word since I'd set up camp. And still, in the dead of night, miles from anyone, I heard my name whispered right into my ear from the other side of that thin nylon wall. I never went back to that ridge again. I had gone camping plenty of times before, and I had gotten used to the strange little sounds that come with sleeping outside. Branches cracking, animals rustling through the brush, the flap of the tent shifting in the wind. None of that bothered me anymore. What happened that night, though, was different. It wasn't the usual kind of nervousness you push away when you remind yourself you're alone in the woods. It was the kind that makes your stomach tighten and your body lock up before your mind even has time to think. I had set up camp off a small forest road, about 4 miles from where I parked my car. It wasn't an official site, just a clearing with enough room for my little tent and a fire pit someone had made before me. The ground was flat, the spot close enough to a stream to refill my bottles, and I hadn't seen anyone all day while hiking in. It was exactly the kind of place I liked. Quiet, away from people. By the time I crawled into my tent that night, the air had cooled down. I zipped myself in, pulled my sleeping bag up tight, and lay listening to the forest. I must have drifted off quickly because the next thing I remember is waking in the dark with my heart pounding. At first, I thought maybe an animal had brushed the tent. That had happened before. Deer nosing around, raccoons scratching at the ground. But this was no light bump. The entire tent collapsed. 1 second I was asleep, the next I was smothered under fabric, the poles bending inward like someone had thrown their full weight down on top of it. The walls pressed against my face, the ceiling sagged down, and I couldn't move without fighting against the nylon. For a split second, I thought someone had jumped on me. My chest locked up with panic, and I scrambled to free myself, clawing at the zipper with shaking hands until I finally ripped it open and pushed my way out into the night air. The cold hit me hard. My breath fogged in front of my face as I stumbled out barefoot, adrenaline flooding through me. I spun in circles, scanning the clearing, expecting to see someone, or something, standing there. But there was nothing. The woods were dead quiet. No footsteps retreating into the trees. No sound of brush being pushed aside. The fire pit was dark and cold, the ground damp with dew. I turned my headlamp on, the beam sweeping back and forth across the trees, the dirt, the stream a little ways off. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I looked down at the tent. The poles were bent awkwardly, like they had been forced inward from the top. It wasn't wind. The air was still, the treetops barely shifting. And it wasn't an animal, not unless a bear had jumped straight down on top of it and vanished without a sound, leaving no tracks at all. The ground around me was soft enough to hold impressions. But when I looked, all I saw were my own prints, messy from where I'd stumbled out. I stood there for a long time with the light shaking in my hand, waiting for something to move in the dark. Nothing ever did. Eventually, I forced myself to breathe slower, to steady my hands, and to start working. I needed to get the tent back up. My fingers were clumsy from the cold and nerves, but I managed to untangle the poles and push them back into shape. I set the tent upright again, though it sagged from where the aluminum had been bent. It didn't look like it would hold up another hit like that. Still, I needed it. I couldn't stand out in the open all night, exposed. When I finally got back inside, I zipped it tight and sat in the dark with my knife in one hand and the light in the other. I didn't lie back down right away. My ears strained against the silence, picking up every little creak of the forest, every faint sound that might have been something moving far off. My own breathing sounded too loud in that small space. Hours dragged by. At some point, the exhaustion won over the fear, and I dozed sitting up with the knife still in my hand. When I woke again, the first hint of dawn was spreading through the trees. The tent was still standing. The clearing was still empty. In the light of morning, I looked for answers. I walked slow circles around my campsite, checking the ground, the trees, the stream bank. I expected to see some kind of trace. Broken branches, prints in the mud, anything that would explain how something heavy enough to flatten my tent could disappear without a sound. But there was nothing. The ground was untouched except for my own scattered tracks. I kept thinking about the way the tent had gone down. It hadn't been pushed over from the side or caught in a gust. It had collapsed inward, straight down like something had dropped right on top of it. The weight had been enough to knock me awake instantly and leave the poles bent. Whatever caused it, I knew it wasn't the wind. And I knew it wasn't my imagination, because I had crawled out from under the tangled mess myself. I packed my things faster than I ever had before. Every sound in the forest made me twitch, made me glance over my shoulder. By the time I had my bag strapped on, my hands were shaking again. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just started walking, fast, not stopping until I was miles closer to the trailhead. The whole hike out, I kept thinking about what could have done it. A person would have made noise, left prints. An animal would have left some kind of sign too. But there was nothing, just a sudden weight, a tent collapsing, and the empty silence afterward. When I finally reached my car, I sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked and the windows rolled up, staring at the tree line. I told myself over and over that it had to have been some kind of accident. Maybe the poles gave out on their own, maybe the ground shifted under the stakes. But deep down I knew the truth. Tents don't just cave in like that. Something forced it down. And the worst part wasn't that it happened. The worst part was that when I scrambled out, desperate to see what had hit me, there was nothing there at all. Nothing at all, but I knew something had been. I had picked a spot that felt perfect when I first set up camp. It was tucked back a little ways from the dirt road, hidden between tall pines with enough space for my tent and a small fire pit. I had hiked most of the day, and by the time I got everything set up and collected wood, the sun had already slipped behind the ridge. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat there for a while, letting the heat soak into me as the woods around me settled into darkness. The fire was the only light. Once the sky went black, the trees looked like they had no end, and the shadows between them felt heavier. That's always how it goes. During the day, the forest feels open, welcoming, but at night it closes in around you, and you're reminded how small you really are out there. I've camped enough to know that feeling, and usually it doesn't bother me. This time, though, there was something about the silence that made me restless. The fire snapped and popped, but beyond that, nothing moved. By the time I crawled into my tent, the fire had burned down to a low glow. I left it smoldering, the faint orange light flickering against the trees. Inside the tent, I stretched out in my sleeping bag, adjusting to the feel of the nylon walls and the cool ground beneath me. I turned on my headlamp for a few minutes to organize my gear, then shut it off and let the dim light from outside filter through the thin fabric. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just the firelight shifting, throwing odd shapes against the wall. But then the shape grew clearer, longer, taller. It stretched across the tent wall, moving slow and steady. A human shape, Shoulders, arms, ahead. The outline of someone walking. I froze. My first thought was that someone had found my camp. Maybe a late hiker had stumbled across me. But the fire was nearly dead, barely enough to cast a glow. For a shadow that clear to show up against the fabric, the person had to be standing close. Too close, right outside the tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched as the shadow slid along the wall, pausing near where my head rested inside. The outline was unmistakable. Someone was out there, circling. My knife was buried in my pack, and my light was beside me, but I didn't dare reach for either. The sound of the zipper or the rustle of fabric might give me away, and if whoever was out there didn't know I was awake, I wanted to keep it that way. The shadow shifted again, moving across the side of the tent. The fire crackled once outside, making the shape flicker. For a moment, it stretched tall, then shrank, then disappeared altogether. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might shake the whole tent. I waited, straining to hear something. Footsteps, breathing, anything. But the woods were silent again. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire dying down to ash. The shadow didn't return. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to sit up. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my headlamp and clicked it on. The sudden brightness inside the tent made me squint, but I felt a little steadier with it. I unzipped the door as slowly as I could and leaned out, shining the beam in quick sweeps around the clearing. The fire was nothing but embers now, glowing faintly red. The trees stood dark and still. The ground around the tent was undisturbed except for my own footprints from earlier. I turned in every direction, scanning for movement, for any sign of someone slipping between the trees. There was nothing. I stepped out fully, my bare feet cold on the ground, and circled the tent. My light cut through the shadows, throwing pale beams against the tree trunks. I expected to see tracks, maybe the outline of boots pressed into the dirt. But there was nothing. No prints, no broken branches, just untouched earth and quiet woods. I stayed outside longer than I wanted to, my nerves stretched tight. The idea of going back into the tent made my skin crawl, but there was nowhere else to go. I couldn't just stand in the open all night. Finally, I crouched down, fed the fire a few sticks, and watched it flare weakly back to life. The light made me feel a little safer, even if it was only an illusion. Back inside the tent, I lay awake for hours. Every shift of the wind, every snap of a twig in the distance made me flinch. My body was tense, waiting for the shadow to return, waiting to hear footsteps outside or feel the wall of the tent brush against me. But the hours dragged on, and nothing came. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, I felt an almost physical relief. I unzipped the tent again and stepped out, the cold morning air hitting me like a shock. The fire was dead now, only blackened wood and faint smoke curling upward. I walked the edge of the clearing, searching carefully for any sign. If someone had been there, they should have left something behind, tracks, disturbed ground, even just bent grass. But the clearing looked untouched. It was like no one had ever been there but me. Still, I couldn't shake what I had seen. The shadow had been too clear, too defined to mistake for a trick of the fire. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had walked past my tent in the middle of the night, close enough for me to see their outline pressed against the wall, close enough to stop right beside my head. I packed up quickly, stuffing gear into my bag with shaking hands. I didn't bother with breakfast, didn't even take the time to check the stream for water. I just wanted to be moving, to put distance between myself and that spot. The whole hike out, I kept replaying it in my head. That shadow stretching across the fabric, silent, steady. The way it paused before moving on. Whoever it was, they hadn't made a sound. Not when they walked, not when they left. And that was the part that bothered me the most. Out in the woods, you always hear people. The crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, the rhythm of steps. But that night, all I had seen was a shadow, moving quietly enough to leave no trace at all. By the time I reached my car, I felt wrung out, my nerves raw. I sat for a while, staring back down the trail, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But no one came. The forest stood silent, just like it had when I'd left the tent. Even now, I can picture it perfectly. The dim glow of the fire outside, the fabric wall of the tent glowing orange, and that shadow stretching across it. A human shape where no one should have been. I never saw their face. I never heard their steps. But I know they were there, and that's what keeps me up sometimes. It's not what I saw, it's what I didn't. I hadn't meant to stay awake that long, but I just couldn't fall asleep. The night was too still, too quiet. My tent was set up in a small clearing, the ground soft with pine needles and dead leaves, and the air had that cool dampness that seeps into your clothes and makes you pull your sleeping bag tighter around you. I had hiked alone all day and had barely seen a soul on the trail, so I expected a peaceful night. Instead, I ended up lying there with my eyes open, listening to every tiny sound the forest made. First, it was normal things. The faint trickle of water from the creek a short distance away. The occasional crack of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. The flap of nylon when the breeze moved through. These were the kinds of noises I'd grown used to, but the longer I stayed awake, the sharper my senses became, until I was hanging on every sound, trying to place it. That's when I heard it, the crunch of leaves. It wasn't sharp or sudden. It was slow. One step, then another. The kind of sound someone makes when they're walking carefully, not rushing, not trying to cover ground, but taking their time. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer. That had to be it, I told myself. Animals wandered through campsites all the time. But as I lay still in my sleeping bag, my ears straining, I realized it didn't sound like a deer at all. There was no light scattering of hooves, no rustle of brush being pushed aside. It was one foot, then the other, deliberate, heavy enough to press the leaves flat but not careless. Human. I froze. The steps moved closer, circling wide around the tent. The fabric glowed faintly from the dying fire I had left outside, but I didn't see a shadow pass by. All I had to go on was the sound. Slow, steady, crunch, crunch, crunch. The steps didn't just pass once and fade away. They kept circling, around and around, the leaves pressing underfoot. Sometimes they drew nearer, close enough that I swore they were just outside the thin nylon wall. Then they drifted away again, still steady, never hurrying. I held my breath, my body stiff, afraid even the sound of moving inside the tent might give me away. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't dare click it on. Whoever or whatever was out there, I didn't want to alert them that I was awake. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sound of the steps didn't stop. The circle continued, tight and controlled, like someone was pacing around and around, inspecting the tent, waiting. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, faster and louder than anything else, but underneath it, the crunch of leaves was steady as ever. At one point, the steps stopped. The silence pressed down so hard it made my skin crawl. I thought maybe they had left, finally moved on. I let out the breath I had been holding. Then the sound came again. Closer this time, just outside where my head lay against the ground. One step, then another. So close I felt the vibration of it in the soil. I bit down on the inside of my cheek to keep from making any noise. Every instinct in me wanted to unzip the tent, jump out, and run into the woods, but I knew how stupid that would be. If someone was out there circling me, running blind through the dark would only make me an easier target. My only choice was to stay still, silent, and wait. The steps circled again, slow and steady, around and around. My body ached from how tense I was, my muscles burning from lying rigid. I tried to count the minutes, but I lost track. The sound became endless, a constant loop of crunching leaves that I couldn't escape. Eventually, sometime deep into the night, the noise faded. The steps grew lighter, then more distant until finally, there was nothing. Just the normal forest again, soft and quiet. I didn't sleep. I lay awake until the blackness outside the tent shifted into gray, until the first signs of dawn crept into the clearing. Only then did I finally unzip the tent and step out into the cold air, my breath misting in front of me. The ground was damp from dew, and I bent down to look. My stomach dropped when I saw them. Footprints, not boots, Not animal tracks, bare feet. The impressions were clear in the soft earth and in the mat of pine needles. They circled the tent again and again, a perfect ring. Some pressed deeper where the person had stood still, right beside my head. The size of the prints made it worse, broad, long, unmistakably adult. Whoever it was had walked barefoot through the woods in the middle of the night, circling me like a predator. I packed up camp as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I kept fumbling with the straps. I didn't bother with breakfast, didn't even stop to finish packing neatly. I just shoved everything into my bag and started down the trail. The whole way back, I couldn't shake the sound. The steady crunch of leaves, circling over and over. It was burned into my head. When I finally reached my car at the trailhead, the relief of locking myself inside was overwhelming. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the forest. I went into the woods for quiet, for peace, for solitude. What I got was someone or something walking barefoot through the dark, circling my tent again and again, close enough to touch me through the fabric. And the part that still keeps me awake when I think about it is how deliberate it all was. They never spoke. They never tried to get in. They just walked, slow, steady, around and around, as if they wanted me to know I wasn't alone, but not why. We had picked a spot deep in the woods, the kind of place where you lose the signal on your phone long before you get there. There were 4 of us camping together, and we wanted somewhere quiet, far from crowds, far from any light but the fire we built ourselves. The trailhead was empty when we parked, and after a few hours of steady hiking, we found a clearing not far from a slow-moving stream. The ground was flat, and the trees were thick enough around us that it felt sheltered. It was perfect for the weekend we had in mind. We pitched our tents, built a fire, and sat around it as the sun dropped behind the trees. We cooked, talked, and eventually let the conversation fade as the fire became the main thing to focus on. The night was calm, colder than expected, but still comfortable as long as we stayed close to the flames. At some point, we all drifted into our tents. The fire died down to embers, and the woods went quiet. I woke sometime after midnight. I couldn't tell what had stirred me at first. The forest wasn't noisy. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing but that strange, heavy silence that makes you more awake the longer you notice it. I shifted in my sleeping bag, listening. That's when I heard it, a giggle. At first, I thought I imagined it. It was faint, quick, and high-pitched, like a child laughing softly. The kind of sound you'd expect in a backyard, not out here where the closest town was miles away. I held my breath, waiting, and then it came again, a little longer, still light and playful, as if a kid was trying to stay quiet but couldn't help it. The hairs on my arms stood up. There were no children here. There shouldn't have been anyone here except the 4 of us. The giggling wasn't coming from far away either. It was outside, close, like it was moving between the trees just a few yards from the tents. I stayed still, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The sound shifted, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes to the side, circling, like someone was deliberately walking around us, letting out these soft bursts of laughter. It didn't sound like multiple people, just one voice, small and strange. After a while, I realized I wasn't the only one awake. I could hear the faint shifting of my friends in their tents, the way sleeping bags rustle when someone's holding still but not asleep. We all knew. We all heard it. None of us said a word. The giggles would fade for a few minutes, then come back again, sometimes right behind the thin nylon wall of my tent. Once, it sounded like it was crouched just above my head, the laugh muffled but sharp, and I could feel my chest tighten until I thought I'd choke from holding my breath. I lay there for hours, every muscle stiff, waiting for it to stop. The woods never gave back their usual sounds. No insects, no owls, just that quiet broken now and then by a sound that didn't belong in the middle of nowhere. Finally, sometime before dawn, the giggling stopped. The silence returned, but it felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath with us. I didn't dare move until the faint gray of morning began seeping through the trees. When we stepped out of our tents, none of us said anything right away. We just looked at each other, all of us pale and drained, like we'd barely slept. The fire pit was as we left it, our bags and packs untouched. But the ground around the camp told a different story. In the soft dirt and patches of leaves, there were footprints. Small ones, bare. They weren't shaped like boots or shoes, not like a hiker would leave. They were the size of a child's feet. But the way they pressed into the soil made it clear they belonged to someone moving with weight and intention. They weren't scattered like a kid running around either. They were deliberate, circling the tents, weaving between the trees, stopping and starting in strange patterns. The sight of them froze me more than the giggling had. It proved that it hadn't been in my head, hadn't been some trick of exhaustion or imagination. Someone had been there, someone barefoot, moving through the woods in the middle of the night, laughing to themselves as they walked around our tents again and again. We didn't linger. We packed quickly, shoving our gear into bags without our usual careful order. My eyes kept darting toward the tree line, half expecting to see a figure standing there, watching us. I couldn't stop thinking about how close they'd been. Just a thin layer of fabric between me and whoever was outside. The hike out was silent. Nobody cracked jokes, nobody slowed down. Every sound behind us made me turn my head, certain that I'd hear that laugh again, light and sharp, too close for comfort. The trail felt longer than before, stretched out by nerves and the constant weight of being followed. When we reached the car, the relief was so strong it made my knees weak. I tossed my pack into the trunk and slammed it shut, scanning the treeline one last time before climbing into the passenger seat. As we pulled away, I kept my eyes on the mirror until the forest disappeared behind us. I never went back to that place. I don't think any of us did. What unsettled me most wasn't just the sound or the footprints. It was the fact that it had all been so quiet. Whoever it was hadn't tried to talk, hadn't tried to scare us with noise or threats. They had just laughed over and over, in the voice of something that shouldn't have been out there, waiting until morning to slip away. That laugh still runs through my head sometimes when I'm alone at night. Not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. There was someone in those woods with us, someone we never saw, someone who wanted us to hear them and nothing more. That kind of patience, the kind that circles your camp for hours, giggling in the dark and leaves no answers behind, is worse than anything else I've ever experienced out there. It leaves you wondering not just who it was, but why they were there at all, and what they might have done if we hadn't left when we did.